Okay, so picking up with the next political philosopher really helped develop and influence American political thought is John Locke. And he's probably more well known, at least in American culture and thought, than Thomas Hobbes. But almost every political philosophy class that focuses on American political thought will talk about both of them. Uh, Locke is a big influencer of Jefferson. And if we say life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that would have been picked up on as a reference to Locke's formulation of life, liberty, and property. And so there is this influence that in a kind of a direct way, where like someone like Jefferson was quoting Locke because he followed a large part of his political philosophy. So Locke writes famously in his book, The Second Treatise on Government. I always wondered, just kind of humorously, what was the first treatise like, because we never hear about it. But his most famous thought comes from his second treatise. And he really emphasizes the idea of government by consent and a limited role of government. And so Locke wrote that people were predisposed to government of one, that is monarchy, because it had been a natural and simple condition under their fathers. So he's actually challenging here an idea common during the time, but foreign to us today, of what's called the divine right of kings, that kings are God's representative on earth to rule over the kingdom. And there could be some thought about that and merit about that, but Locke really challenges that. And he speaks of, like Hobbes, a state of nature, which is not historically proven, not demonstrable, not something that it was definitely this way. This is more of a theory. And his is a little bit more generous to human nature, but it is still suspicious of human nature. And he develops this political philosophy that challenges the idea that the king should rule by divine right. And he more moves toward what would be familiar in American thought of that government has its justification in the consent of the people, that government ought to be by the people. That's kind of where he's headed, not in such a direct way of thinking of just pure direct democracy, but the idea of that people ought to have some form of consent to the government. Now, he believes that monarchy is simple, and he's right, that monarchy does allow for a simplicity of government, a simplicity of rule, a simplicity of responsibility that other forms do not have. And there could be an argument made for some benefits of monarchy are that monarchs often view their kingdom, whether rightly or wrongly, they often view it as their own property. And so they have an interest in maintaining their own property and passing it on to the next generation in their heir. So monarchs may limit themselves as far as taxation or things like that in a way that democracy would not. But monarchy is what Locke is kind of challenging. He says monarchy also has a tendency toward empire, encroachment on liberty, and absolute power. And he's right about that the history of Europe and really worldwide, we can see that monarchy did fight several territorial wars in a quest for empire, that monarchy did encroach on the liberty of its citizens, that monarchy did often become a despotism under absolute power. Now, that being said, that does not mean that democracy or constitutional democracy has not had those same issues, but had them in different ways. So his idea is that if government was more lodged in the people, and the king and the government was limited, that would be a benefit. So Locke argued for a separation of powers. Now, he's not the only one to do this, and he's probably in this area of his argumentation not the most influential on the Americans. There's another theorist named Montesquieu who is more influential in his idea of separation of powers than Locke, but he does talk about it. Okay. Locke challenged, as I said, the divine right of kings, Latin jure divino, the idea that kings rule by appointment from God directly. Locke also developed further the concept of government by consent, but he does it in a different way than Hobbes. He says, as far as we have any light from history, we have reason to conclude that all peaceful beginnings of government have been laid in the consent of the people. Okay, so that's where he kind of directly uses that type of phrase, the consent of the people. Or Jefferson would later say that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. Now he says that governments that have these peaceful beginnings are laid in the consent of the people. That's where they found their authority and their governance. Locke taught that people would choose to leave what he called that state of nature, that state that is of anarchy absent a government, and mutually consent to the rule of government to protect their property. So the idea of government is more of one of collective self-defense, that it would be right for me and allowable for me, in Locke's view, to defend my property, my life, my liberty, that it would be okay to defend those things even to the death with self-defense if someone else were attacking them. Now, it would also be okay with me to join with others to protect those things. Now, Locke takes it further in that sense of collective self-defense and says that people would leave the state of nature in order to join with others, and we would all just suddenly agree and consent that we're going to have this entity of government rule over us, but have the limited role of protection of property. And for Locke, property includes protection of life and liberty as well. Our bodies are property, our stuff is property, our basic freedom is our property. So he would argue for those things as well. He says the enjoyment of the property that he has in this state is very unsafe. So in the state of nature, absent government, Locke's theory goes that we wouldn't be able to enjoy our property because someone could overpower us against our rights. And other people may feel threatened because we could overpower them or outsmart them or whatever the situation might turn out to be. So he says that it makes us limited in the enjoyment of our property. It makes us very unsafe. He says this makes him willing to quit this condition, the state of nature, meaning we're done with that, and to join in a society with others for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates, which I call by the general name property. Life, liberty, property. So Locke formulates this idea of that the role of government is a limited one for collective self-defense to protect life, liberty, and property from criminal behavior, from murder, from enslavement, from rape, from kidnap, from theft or destruction of persons or property. And that was what he says, that we would be willing to consent to a government that does that, because otherwise, if our only guarantee is that our rights are just based on whether or not we're stronger or smarter than others, then our rights may not be safe. So he believes in a government to protect limited government to protect these particular rights. Now he says government exists to protect these rights, not to violate them. So, and this is Jefferson's thinking as well, if a government goes beyond its role here and starts itself to harm life, liberty, and property, that would not be a government of consent. It would not be a government of legitimacy. Locke also wrote that the government should be responsible to make law, should have courts to interpret law, and should have the ability to use force to enforce the law. So we see those aspects in American government as well. Now, Locke develops this idea of, and there will be another video that's more of a critique of some of these things, but of the difference of tacit consent versus expressed consent. Express consent to a contract. Now, sometimes this is called social contract theory. Express consent to a contract is signing the contract, making a verbal agreement, shaking hands, saying yes, giving your approval, giving your vote yes to something. That's what consent is, that you allow something. You invite something, you accept something, and you do so with express consent in a direct and clear way. Okay, so that the assumption is you have not consented until you have actually given some indication directly, like signing or voting yes or saying verbally that you consent. Okay. Locke's problem is, if we say we have a government by consent, there was never any time where the government came by and asked, do you consent? And you had to say yes or no. It was just assumed. You didn't get to sign on the dotted line. You didn't get to have a chance to say no. And if you said no today to the government, to consent to the government, whatever government you live under, likely that would not be taken as legitimate. You must consent even if you're saying no. So he develops this area of tacit consent, which is more so the idea of, we really can't just go around and ask people, everyone under a government, if they consent. So we have to assume that they already do consent. And I'll deal with problems with that at another time, but that's tacit consent. It's assumed to be the case that you consent. And even if you withdraw your consent, arguably, you still must follow the system. Okay, so tacit consent is not the same as express consent. And you can think about how many contracts work off of tacit consent. And I'm not doing my critique of this idea now, but if someone wanted you to sign a contract and said, you're going to follow the terms of this contract and you will be punished if you don't, and even if you say no, you're still going to get the benefits of this contract, and if you don't like it, you have to leave the country. Right? That would be how tacit consent in a contract would work, but no legally binding contracts work that way. So it's something to consider. Okay? He says here, for if the consent of the majority shall not in reason be received as the act of the whole, and conclude every individual, nothing but the consent of every individual can make anything to be the act of the whole, which, considering the infirmities of health and the avocations of business, which in a number, though much less than that of a commonwealth, will necessarily keep many away from the public assembly. And the variety of opinions and contrariety of interests which unavoidably happen in all collections of men, it is next to impossible to be had. For where the majority cannot conclude the rest, there cannot act as one body, and they cannot act as one body, and consequently will be immediately dissolved again. Okay, so here's Locke's problem with express consent in layman's terms. It would be hard or impossible to get the express consent of everybody. So he says, really, the consent, what we mean is the consent of the majority. Most people agree. But now we have to ask, is just because a majority consents, does that mean everybody agreed legitimately? Because a majority could vote for slavery. But just because a majority agrees to slavery and a minority does not, and they vote for it and they consent to it, does that make slavery acceptable? And have the slaves in that system consented to slavery because a majority of people with power agreed? Now, Locke says this would be too inconvenient. Infirmities of health. People would be sick. So if we said 5 o'clock on Friday, everybody show up and you give your yes or no vote to whether you consent to the government. He says, well, they're old people. They're unhealthy. And he said, so they won't be able to make it. And then some people are away on business or they're busy. They can't make it at that time. And he said, so the amount of people you get to show up wouldn't be everybody, but you need everybody to give their consent for the government to arguably be legitimate. So he said, basically, we would never get this to happen on a number that's the size of a commonwealth. Now, if your commonwealth's 5 people, maybe you could get 5 people to show up at an appointed time. But if your commonwealth is 1,000 people, it would be hard to get everybody to show up and then every single person to agree to consent to the government. Okay, well, what's the role of the government? How do you know if you want to consent to it or not? So he says, where the majority cannot conclude for the rest, there they cannot act as one body. Okay, so he says that what we're really talking about is not the consent of everybody, but the consent of the most numerous, the consent of the majority. Okay, so this is where Locke says it wouldn't really be possible to get the consent of everybody. But here's another question. If that's the case, is this really government by consent? Is that really the argument? Because if your argument is the government is only legitimate when it rests on the consent of the governed, but we really don't mean the consent of everybody, we just mean the consent of the people who happen to have the majority. Is that really a strong argument for government by the consent of the people, right? Because the people means everyone. It doesn't just mean most people who happen to vote one way, the consent of voters. So he argues it's the consent of the majority, not the consent of all. We have to ask ourselves, is that true consent? It would be difficult. His argument is that it would be difficult or impossible to get the consent of all because of inconvenience. So he replaces the category of express consent with that of tacit consent, that consent must be assumed. Now, I can think of a couple cases, at least one comes to mind, where consent is assumed. And that would be in like unconscious CPR. Someone is unconscious and someone does CPR or a doctor performs surgery on them without their consent to save their life. Now, they couldn't get their consent, so they had to work off of tacit consent. But in most other cases of any type of agreement or contract, tacit consent will not cut it. I thought about a restaurant where you go in and the assumed contract is that you are going to pay for the meal after eating. The problem, and that is true, and that is right, and a contract is made non-verbally that way in many cases. However, there's not a monopoly where only that restaurant is there and that you are forced to pay for and receive its services. And and then you've consented to pay. That's not quite the same situation as you would have arguably with a government. Okay, so Locke would say that that people have consented to the government because people don't leave. They could vote with their feet. So if you don't like it and you don't consent to the government, then leave. People accept government services. People drive on the roads. Therefore, they've consented to the government, would be his argument. And people follow the laws. Okay? Now, just by doing those things, have people shown expressly that they agree with the government over them and that they have given their consent? That is what we have to answer. Now, Locke is extremely important, not so much for his consent argument, but he's extremely important for the influence in the West, in Western Europe, especially Britain and America as well, in terms of the role of the government being a limited one to protect particular rights. Now, for him, that's life, liberty, and property. Okay, so that comes up later in the American formulation and political philosophy of government as one of the options that Americans follow with regard to the role and function of government.